All right. So here are some of the benefits. Purpose of the eStewards. Steps to certification. Excuse me. And again, all this presentation, if you have questions, you want to see the slides afterwards, we'll be posting it to our website. You can download the audio of it, and you can download the slides themselves. So if you missed anything or didn't catch something that, obviously because you couldn't see it and I talked about, it'll be available after this. So the eStewards transition, excuse me, since the new version 2.0 came out this past November of 2013, there's a transition period of 18 months basically that anybody who was previously certified can upgrade to version 2. They have to do it within that 18 months. So anybody who was not certified previously has up until May 1st of this year to get certified to version 1, which means your stage 1 and your stage 2 has to be completed before May 1st, and all your nonconformances need to be closed out prior to that date to be certified to version 1. If that doesn't happen, if you had planned on stage 1 in, say, April, stage 2 in May, at that point you'd have to upgrade to version 2. So we could, if you need a little more time to make sure that you meet all the additional requirements or changes to version 2, that definitely get a hold of us to make sure that we are aware of that, and we can work with you to reschedule those audits. So again, anything after May 1st, then we'll have to be to version 2. Anybody who's currently certified to version 1 has until May 1st of 2015 then, which is the 18-month period, to have an upgrade audit to version 2. So technically, you could have an audit in April to version 1 if you're having a surveillance audit, let's say, and then by next May 1st, 2015, you'd have to have that, your next audit would have to be to version 2. So one requirement with eStewards, or I guess one potential benefit, is they do allow multi-site sampling. So if you have, say, 5 facilities within the U.S., they all do relatively the same thing. They have the same processes. We can perform a sampling of those sites, and that's for your surveillance and recertification audits. For any initial certification audit for any site, each site will have to be audited separately initially. Now, once each site has been approved and issued a certificate, then it can be incorporated into the overall multi-site. So if you had a number of sites, say 10 sites, the normal sampling procedure would require that, would not require all sites to be seen. You could do a sampling, and you may not see a few sites during a given 3-year cycle. eStewards says every site has to be seen within that 3-year cycle. So although you can do sampling, we need to make sure that every site is seen. For your remote sites, now the version 2.0 comes out with a definition for ancillary sites, which we'll get into in a minute. But ancillary sites are not considered remote sites. Let's say you have a collection site, and all you do is collection at that site, and then you ship it to, you transport it to your main facility. If it's just collection, that's not a remote site, that's an ancillary site, and does not need to have its own separate audit. Now, if you have one facility and a year later you start up another facility or you purchase another facility, you then have 18 months to get that facility certified. Because again, every facility within a given country has to be certified. Okay, I'm going to stop right there just for a second and see if anybody has any questions on the certification process. So if you have questions, type them into the question section. It looks like I don't see any questions at the moment. Here's a question. Could you explain the all sites in a 3-year cycle? Does this mean to version 2.0 within 18 months? So initially for your multi-site, let's say you have 5 sites initially. All 5 of those sites need to be certified within 18 months. You might start out with 1 site the first year, or 4 sites throughout the first year. Those all need to be seen individually. So then in 2015, let's say, then you could incorporate that into a sampling. So you could do generally headquarters plus, if you have 4 sites, it would be headquarters plus 2 for your surveillance. So 1 site would not need to be seen for that first surveillance. So let's say at the end of the 18 months, you have that 5th site brought in. You have that one certified. That one needs to be audited separately. Once that one is audited and certified, you can then bring that into the other 4 sites as one multi-site for the 5 sites. So at that point, generally for the first 3-year cycle, you're going to have to see all the sites anyways because that's the initial certification. But the following years, during that 3-year cycle, you're going to have to make sure that you see, if you had a total of 10 sites, you're looking at generally a sampling, headquarters plus 2, and then headquarters plus 3 for your recertification. So if that sampling basically didn't require you to have to go to every single site with the normal IAF procedures, in eStewards that doesn't matter. You still have to go to every site. So you're going to have to add whatever site is kind of left over. You're going to have to add that somewhere into that certification cycle. I hope that makes sense. Yes, so all sites, anybody who's eStewards or potentially going to be eStewards, they have to be certified to version 2 at the very latest by May 1st of 2015. So that basically means, and that's not, you need to have your audit done by then, you need to have all the nonconformances, everything closed out by that date. If you had your audit in April but it didn't get closed out until, say, June, you could still get certified to version 2, but you'd have a lapse in your certificate. So basically it means you would not be certified for that month. And if that's a customer requirement, that could be an issue. So we want to make sure that if you need to upgrade, if you're currently to version 1 and you need to upgrade, that you do that with plenty of time. I would say February, March at the very latest, to get that upgrade audit. All right. Okay, well, let's move on to some of the requirements of eStewards. Again, I kind of tried selecting some of the more prescriptive requirements or some of the more challenging requirements, key requirements that I'm sure many of you are wanting to know about. If you've read through the standard or know the standard, you know it's pretty involved. So we could spend a whole day or a whole week going through all the specific requirements. But If you have any additional questions or you want to talk about something that we didn't talk about here, feel free to email me or call me. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So hazardous electronic equipment, otherwise known as HEEs, this is a definition within eStewards. This is sort of the basis of what the eStewards standard is about, making sure that this type of equipment is handled properly. So equipment that contains asbestos, all types of batteries, your CRTs, your cathode ray tubes, circuit boards, lamps, switches, any other parts, materials, assemblies, housings, cables, wires, which contain, in the standard, there are a set of hazardous, basically chemicals that they list levels. If you've tested this equipment and it's above any of those T-clip levels, that's considered an HEE and needs to be handled properly. Anything that contains mercury, such as circuit boards, lamps, switches, LCD displays, anything containing PCBs, radioactive waste, selenium and arsenic, those are generally found in your printer or copy drums, and then any other material that's deemed hazardous waste. So anything that, especially that in the circuit board, the fourth bullet point here, where it's above the threshold level, that's considered hazardous waste. So it's not. In other countries, might have their own requirements as well. So you need to make sure that you're looking at the eStewards requirements, but also any import-export requirements from that country as far as what they considered hazardous material. So from the HEEs, we have our hazardous electronic waste. So your hazardous electronic waste is basically an HEE that is destined or is intended to be destined for recycling, energy recovery, final disposal, which also includes shredded material, components, residues, and parts removed during repair, and also repair, refurbishment, or reuse, but not direct reuse. So if you're sending something downstream that needs to be repaired or refurbished before it can be sent for reuse, that's considered an HEW. If you've repaired it on site and it's ready for reuse, it doesn't require any more refurbishment or processing, that's direct reuse. That is not considered an HEW. At that point, it's a commodity ready to be sold. Excuse me. Electronic equipment, including components that is tested and fully functional, but for which a direct reuse market has not been affirmed according to the requirements for reuse. So eStewards has specific requirements that say, even if you've deemed it tested and fully functional and it's ready for reuse, even if your facility has determined that, if where you're sending to, there is not a direct reuse market, it cannot be considered to go for reuse. It has to be sent for recycling. Now, if you wanted to go to a different country that had a direct reuse market, that would be an option. But we'll get into the reuse, but there's some specific requirements around where you can send it and what you need to do to ensure that there's a market in place for that equipment. And deemed hazardous waste or banned for importation by the country of import or transit, regardless of type of destination or condition of equipment. So if you've refurbished something, it's tested and fully functional, you could be sending it to a country that has said, will not accept any material like this. I know Egypt has some pretty strict requirements as far as what type of equipment they will accept. So some countries are leaning towards saying they won't accept anything. So make sure that you've done your due diligence and are clear on what that import country's requirements are. So your potentially hazardous processing technologies, your PHPTS, if you have any of these on site, they generally require a lot more, a much higher level of a risk assessment to be done and much higher level of monitoring to be done. So technologies, activities, or operations which process hazardous electronic equipment and or problematic components or materials including. So if you're doing shredding, cutting, grinding, crushing, breaking, baling, any of those things on this list, that's a PHPT. If you're opening, dismantling, or repairing mercury-containing devices, that process is considered a PHPT, or thermal or chemical processes, such as smelting, refining, anything like that. So if you're doing any of those activities, that is a PHPT. So when you're reading through the standard, there are specific requirements around PHPTs that you'll need to be aware of and need to follow. So an eStewards EMS or environmental management system applies to the electronic equipment, property, and assets under the organization's ownership and or control. So if you are handling material, you're processing material, you are able to get certified to eStewards for electronic equipment. It also applies to workers, including temporary, part-time, and contract workers, volunteers, and interns. So basically anybody who's at your facility, working at your facility on this equipment, all the requirements within the standard apply to them as well. The eStewards policy. So every organization that's eStewards certified has to have a policy in place. Similar, if you're familiar with any of the other ISO standards, they all require a policy to be in place. The eStewards policy ensures that you have a commitment to the prevention of exports of hazardous electronic waste throughout the recycling chain, to make sure you're not violating any international laws, treaties, and agreements. This is one thing that eStewards is very prescriptive on. This and also making sure that the workers are protected. So they have a lot of very, I guess, specific requirements that need to be followed to make sure that this is being met. So they want to make sure that you have that commitment in place. And then obviously the prohibition of forced or child labor throughout the recycling chain, no use of prison operations, those kind of things. And then lastly is the social accountability values within its organizations. Make sure it's consistent with principles such as SA 8000. So if you're not familiar with that standard, it might be a good idea to do a little research, and or if you have questions, you can contact me as well. So getting into what was kind of formerly known as environmental aspects is now environmental and stewardship aspects. So at least every 3 years, an organization needs to conduct a risk assessment. That needs to be conducted by an occupational environmental health and safety professional. So you can't just designate somebody, you potentially can't even designate your safety person to do this test unless they are considered an occupational environmental health and safety professional. And there's, within the standard, the definition section, there's a definition for what this occupational environmental health and safety professional is and how who meets this requirement. So the risk assessment shall give consideration to customer data privacy, downstream risks, any potential releases to the environment, stormwater runoff, air emissions. Then you also have physical hazards, chemical hazards, biological hazards, practices to decrease worker exposure and take-home contamination, accident investigation, making sure you're looking at past accidents, understanding why they happen, ensuring that you can prevent them from happening again, and then potentially any other hazards you may have on site. So there's still the requirements of identifying the significant environmental and stewardship aspects, having controls around those. But again, I just tried picking out some of the key requirements that are a little bit different than they may have been in the past. Getting on to legal, export, transit, and import requirements, which is a lot of this and the downstream due diligence. This is a pretty key component of the overall standard. So an organization shall ensure legal transboundary movement of used electronic equipment. So making sure that not only where you're where the equipment's being sent to is legal, but along that whole transportation process that is legal. And this includes if it's being shipped on boats, trains, planes, it doesn't matter. You want to make sure that if it's stopping somewhere, if however it's being transported is legal. So make sure that it follows requirements of basically the OECD, the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. So the Basel Convention basically says that you cannot ship hazardous equipment like this to developing countries. Basically they have to be, you can ship Basel to a Basel country to another Basel country. And then thirdly, the Basel Convention Decision 3.1, also known as the Basel Ban Amendment, is basically that's being applied to. So it's key to make sure that you know what these conventions, the Basel Convention, the Basel Ban Amendment, and OECD, what those requirements are to make sure you're doing things legally. Because in here, especially here in the U.S., since we are an OECD country, but we did not sign the Basel Convention or the Basel Ban Amendment. So we have, in the U.S., a little bit more freedom sometimes to ship equipment to other countries, possibly developing countries. But according to eStewards, what may be allowed here in the U.S. isn't allowed by the standards. So make sure that you are aware of what those requirements are. And obviously any other applicable international laws or national legislation. Because, again, certain countries may have more strict requirements than any of these international requirements here that are identified above. And then ensuring that each shipment of hazardous e-waste is exported or imported only as follows. Implementation of the Basel Ban Amendment. So when exported from an OECD or EU countries and Liechtenstein, shipments shall only go to and through countries in that same group. And the trade is for recycling and not final disposal. So if you are an OECD country, you need to make sure that it stays within the OECD countries. Implementation of trade ban between Basel parties and non-parties. Implementation of the Basel Convention, regional agreements, and national laws. So again, I would highly recommend that if you are not familiar with these requirements, that you do some research and that you fully understand what these requirements are. So here's kind of the hierarchy that eStewards has put forward. So the organization shall document and implement a plan for responsible management and disposition of electronic equipment received by the eStewards organization or under their control in a manner that protects human health and the environment and is in conformity with the standard. So first is direct reuse of tested working equipment and components. If something's obviously if we can do that, that's the most preferred. If it's not capable of that, then we want to see if it's possible and if there's a market in place for refurbishment and repair for reuse. If the equipment is deemed not capable of reuse, whether the cost to repair it doesn't make sense, you're not going to get your money back out of it, or there's no market for that type of equipment, then we want to recover as much of that material as possible. So material recovery for use in new products or applications. And then you have, at the end, the very least preferred is obviously disposal. So eliminate and mitigate significant environmental and stewardship aspects. So part of that risk assessment, once you've identified, especially if you have the PHPTS on site, once you've identified what your risks are, you want to make sure that you have basically the occupational health and safety and industrial hygiene program in place to address any of those risks, such as airborne hazard controls, housekeeping. Version 2 places a big emphasis on housekeeping, making sure you have a housekeeping program in place. And that's partially to help prevent that take-home contamination from workers. making sure that the ergonomic controls are in place, noise controls are in place, and then controls for any significant environmental stewardship aspects are in place. So for reuse and refurbishment of electronic equipment, this is taken from the standard. So you have fully test electronic equipment and ensure full functionality. You want to sanitize any customer data. Label identifying records of equipment for reuse. The version 2.0 has a lot of requirements around labeling, how to label certain equipment, making sure you have your records for what was tested, making sure that either it's fully functional or the key components have been tested and they meet the customer requirements. Anything that's shipped is packaged properly, so that if you're dealing with hazardous electronic waste or HEWs, that when it's being shipped, you're not having any accidental releases of any contamination or any hazardous material. For anything that's going to reuse, you want to make sure you verify and document the reuse market in that area where it's being sold to. If, sometimes people buy in bulk. If you're sending 100 laptops or 100 pieces of equipment to somebody, making sure that you have a take-back program in place in case anything is broken or was broken during transportation, that they can send that back to you. And then ensure responsible management of e-waste, control outsource reuse activities. So if you're not doing the refurbishment on site, that you have control over the downstream process that's handling the refurbishment and reuse activities. So if something is fully tested, it's fully tested electronic equipment, ensure full functionality. You want to make sure that you determine and document the state of health of each rechargeable battery. In the standard, they have specific requirements for the types of batteries and what those minimum amount of charge that's in that battery, how much is left. And if it's below that, eStewards says it cannot go for reuse. Determine the state. So you have mobile phone batteries have their own, photovoltaic modules have their own, test CRT devices that are destined for remanufacturing. CRTs have their own requirements in order, they have to meet a certain requirement to be able to go for reuse. So there's a lot of prescriptive requirements around reuse and what can go for reuse and what are the minimums of that to be able to go for reuse. So make sure you're aware of all those as well. Accountability for downstream recycling. This is more the downstream due diligence, making sure that all your downstream vendors who you are using, whether it's for further processing for recycling or whether it's going for reuse, meet the requirements. So all eStewards recyclers need to maintain a downstream disposition chart for all their HEWs and PCMs. PCMs are basically your problematic materials that may have the potential to be cause harm, have hazardous components in them. Make sure you conduct the due diligence and ensure responsible management of PCMs. Conduct ongoing due diligence on all immediate downstream processors of HEWs and ensure responsible management of HEWs. And I'll talk more about the on-site versus off-site audits for your immediate downstream processors. Conduct ongoing due diligence to ensure responsible management of HEWs beyond IDPs throughout the recycling chain. So here we have, for conducting your due diligence, all immediate downstream processors prior to use have to have an on-site audit unless they are eStewards certified. If they are not eStewards, they need to have that initial on-site audit and annual on-site audits as well to make sure that they are doing things according to the eStewards requirements. So if they're eStewards, you do not have to do an on-site audit. So it's a lot of companies are trying to make sure they find companies now who are eStewards. It makes their life a lot easier. And then if you're sending it to an end processor, an on-site audit needs to be conducted at least every 3 years. So you may do the initial, and you don't have to do another on-site audit for another 3 years if they're an end processor. Restriction on materials, recovery, and final disposition operations. So you want to make sure that the facilities are licensed and permitted. Ensure they use the best and most applicable technology for processing that material. Disallow certain types of management downstream. And this may also come from your customers. They may say that they want their material processed in a certain way. Ensure HEWs, again that's your hazardous electronic waste, that they don't go to solid waste disposal. Get approval for alternative uses of HEWs. If they're wanting to use an HEW possibly in manufacturing of a new product or for a new use, you want to make sure you get approval through eStewards to allow that. And then restrict HEWs and PCMs to specified destinations. So with eStewards, there's a huge emphasis on tracking equipment, making sure that all equipment that's handled by an organization is accounted for. So all incoming equipment, all outgoing equipment that's going for recycling, all outgoing equipment that's going for reuse. So you really should have some sort of mass balance tracking system in place. And that's one requirement as far as you have a report that needs to be given to eStewards, and you need to make on an annual basis. So you need to make sure that you're tracking all this equipment, and that'll get reported to eStewards as well. So link material balance accounting with shipping records to downstream vendors. You know, basically you want to have what's coming in, what you currently have on site, and what's going out in all directions, making sure that everything's accounted for. And that'll need to be verified, especially during audits, against shipping records and what's going to the different downstream vendors. And then this is the report to eStewards database. So prior to initial certification, and then annually, basically before January 1st of every year, you need to send a report to eStewards. It includes the address for primary location and description of the site, the number of individuals who worked for more than 1 month during the 12-month period. And again, this includes obviously temporary interns, everybody who has worked there for more than 1 month. Description of all processes taking place at the site, and then the total weight or unit count of the electronic equipment, components, and materials processed in inventory and under the organization's control. So you want to make sure that you can either do it by weight, or you can do it by unit count, or you can do it by combination of the two. Especially if some are being sent out for reuse, those are generally done by unit count. If it's going for recycling, that's generally done by weight. So you want to make sure that somehow that everything's getting accounted for, and you can put it into one mass balance spreadsheet. So those are some of the main components of the standard. Obviously, it's a very high-level discussion on it. There are many other things, and we could spend much more time going over in greater detail each specific requirement, but just to kind of give you an overview of the standard and what some of the key requirements are, and to how to what you need to do to obtain certification. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, we have about 10 minutes or so. We can spend some time going over any questions. Again, if you have a more in-depth question you want an answer to, give me a call or an email, and I'll be happy to answer that for you. So here's the question. Suppose I have a potential customer who wants to incinerate some celluloid tapes. There are companies who can accommodate this. This service, according to eStewards, I cannot fulfill the customer's requirements because of the landfill incineration restrictions. It's a little more challenging. Customers can have, unless the customer says that they have to have it done a certain way, that may be one way around it. But if there's no specific customer requirement, the idea is everything should go for reuse. But obviously there's some things that are a little more sensitive that they want taken care of, they want incinerated. So that could be a potential option. Here's a question. How does the R2 2013 come into play with eStewards? At this point, it does not. R2 2013 and eStewards are completely separate. I know in the past with R2 2008 and eStewards version 1, they had incorporated R2 into the eStewards as well. So at one point with the eStewards standard, you would get basically 3 certifications. You get the eStewards, R2, and the 14. But with version 2 and with the new R2 2013, they're completely separate. They really, at this point, do not have any interaction with each other. So on the right here, I put a few resources. This is just the eStewards website, the BAN website. Here's the ANAB. They have some of the eStewards requirements on the ANAB website, and then here's a link to the PGR website. But I'll pull up the next page here. This has all my contact information. So if you want to contact me, my email address, phone number, extension, and also if you're interested in getting a quote, you can call our sales department, and they'll be happy to provide a quote for you. So here's the question. So what is the purpose of the R2 standard? They're really 2 different standards. The purpose of R2 is similar. R2 allows a little bit more freedom in some areas. R2 is, it's dealing with electronic waste, making sure that it's disposed of properly, or not as disposed of, but recycled and processed properly. It's just a different set of requirements. It's not. Some people choose to go R2. Some people choose to go eStewards. It's really a personal preference. There's obviously different costs associated with each one. With R2, you're required to now have certification to ISO 14001 and OSAS 18001, or you'll have certification for R2 with RIOS. So it's either 14, 18 and R2, or you can go R2 and RIOS. There may be alternatives. Some people may consider R2 and eStewards. If you chose to go that route, that may be an option. We would have to get approval from R2 Solutions for that, but that is an option. Question: is the audit days the same for both standards? I assume you're referring to R2 and eStewards. It is not. R2 has come up with their own methodology for determining audit days. R2 is generally less days, but it also requires additional time for 14 and 18, or the additional time for RIOS. So it's, although the R2 is less, you have more days added on for the other standards. With eStewards, it follows the 14,001 quoting requirements. So basically takes the 14 and adds basically multiplied by 150%, and you get your eStewards time. So you have the 14,001 days plus the eStewards days for eStewards. But there's, R2 has their own licensing fee. eStewards has their licensing fee. RIOS has their licensing fee. So it really depends on the size of your organization, what you're looking to accomplish. If you prefer eStewards or you prefer R2. But if you have questions, you want to know what the different costs would be going either way, we're more than happy to sit down with you and go over some of those options. Here's a question. Can you briefly describe the definition of the e-steward of EH&S professional that must audit the process every 3 years? The risk assessment needs to be conducted at least every 3 years. So you need to conduct an initial risk assessment to determine what your risks are and make sure you have the proper controls and monitoring in place. The standard says you need to conduct that risk assessment basically at least every 3 years, or if significant changes occur. So if you were to add a new process, you were to add a large shredder, or something like that, obviously that creates new risks, and a new risk assessment will need to be conducted. It's really, some organizations choose every year, some stick with the minimal of at least every 3 years. So, but just make sure that if you have changes that occur at your facility, that you're recognizing that and you're getting another risk assessment done. I hope that helps, Mike. If you have any follow-up, let me know. So each are, again, I'm assuming you're talking about R2 and eStewards. Each are approved by ANAB. That's correct. Either way, you're going to have an ANAB seal on your certificate. If you go to the ANAB website, they have different procedures for both R2 and eStewards. So, but yes, they both are accredited through ANAB. So it's a good idea to have a consultant to provide the best standard to apply to for your organization. I mean, as far as consultant goes, it depends on which way you're leaning. If eStewards, R2, but I mean, if you're unfamiliar with the standards or a lot of the specific requirements, I would definitely recommend getting a consultant to help you with that. Consultants tend to speed up the process for implementing a management system as well. But again, if you choose to get a consultant or not, that's a decision that's best made by the organization on a case-by-case basis. But if you're looking to determine what standard might be best, a consultant could possibly help you with that, or you can call me and I can kind of talk to you about the differences and what sort of processes you have at your organization, and we can kind of work through what might be the best route to take. So it looks like we are at noon. I don't see any other questions at this time. So if you have, here's one more question. And size of the organization, or call PJI for this information. Yeah, I mean, it's based on the size of the organization, the risks, the risk level of your organization, what type of processing you have at the organization. It takes into account many things, the number of downstream vendors, where those downstream vendors are located, what type of processing they're doing. So it's something we really need to kind of sit down and discuss to kind of come up with what options are best. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. I hope it was useful and helpful, and hopefully if we can speak sometime in the near future if you have any questions. Other than that, I look forward to hopefully having you on future webinars. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll be in touch soon.